Hi, I'm Kyriakos Gold, and tonight on Think Greek, we are talking about society and the revolution with Viv Nguyen and Nikos Papastergiadis.
Many people tell the story that the diaspora was the source and the origin and the inspiration of the revolution. And that is true. But also, that's the story of the winners.
Greece needed that. As a small nation, we needed to hang on to our past, the glorious past.
The need for SBS, for example, arose as part of the failure of the mainstream media to show something about the non-Anglo-Saxon communities here.
And so we ghettoise Australian multiculturalism as though it's this optional parallel universe.
At some point, someone said, you should be free. And people said yes. Everywhere else in Europe at that point of time, if someone said, you should be free, they said, are you joking?
You can have a bunch of elites over here, but it's the people that will drive the change. And we need the will of the people. The people elect the representatives, and we can do a better job at electing the people into the structure so they then can change the structure.
Kalispera σας and welcome to Think Greek. Today we talk about society and the Greek Revolution. And with us we've got Viv Nguyen and Nikos Papastergiadis. Nikos, we're going to start with you. You're the expert on all things society in the Greek community. How did the Ottoman Empire look like? Where were the Greeks placed in the puzzle, in the mosaic of cultures?
Well, the Ottoman Empire is a bit of a mystery in contemporary things because it has a very negative representation, especially from the Greek perspective. But relative to other empires in the European and Asian context, it was quite tolerant. It was a polyglot and polycultural, multicultural empire. It didn't impose common standards in the way that other European empires at that time were, very determined and very vigorously and quite dogmatically, I would say, imposing cultural, linguistic standards upon their culture. So there was a degree of flexibility and individual freedom that existed in the Ottoman Empire that's often underplayed in contemporary discussions, especially from the Greek side of it. But the Greeks were dispersed quite far and wide. They weren't concentrated neatly in the territory that we today call the Greek nation state. In fact, the borders of Hellenism were spread all across the eastern half of the Mediterranean, up the Balkans, and along the Black Sea. So traditionally, the Greeks see the Mediterranean Sea as the frogs see a pond. This was Socrates' famous phrase, that Greeks go to the water. And all along the edges of the Levantine coastline, North Africa, the eastern and western side of Turkey, the Balkan areas, even as far as Nice and Marseille, which are Greek words, Marseille and Niki. These were Greek cities, as was most of southern Europe. But under the Ottoman Empire, there were many Greeks dispersed across this region, up to Romania and Bulgaria, and even Odessa in the Ukraine today. In fact, one of the great British historians of the Greek Revolution, Richard Clogg, said one of the paradoxes of the Greek Revolution is that as the Hellenic state was founded, Hellenism contracted. Under the Ottoman Empire, Hellenism was a cultural way of being, so that people did not necessarily have to see themselves as Greeks, but could see themselves as Hellenic, because it was culturally, economically, entrepreneurially a way of progressing and being outward and being engaged with the world. But then when Greece became a nation state and decided to monopolize the idea of what Hellenic was, then other states, when they became independent, like Romania or Bulgaria, they distanced themselves from Hellenism and certainly the modern Turkish state also distanced itself from any Hellenic association. So there was a division and contraction of Hellenism. So Hellenism was absolutely essential for the Greek Revolution, but the Greek Revolution was not very good for the maintenance and dispersal of Hellenism.
When you described the Ottoman Empire, my mind went back to the Roman Empire and the Hellenistic period. Are they comparable in the sense of Hellenic culture being dominant?
Well, I wouldn't say Hellenic culture was dominant. But it wasn't. It was powerful, and it wasn't equivalent like as it was in the Roman Empire. But it was certainly powerful. All along the western coast of modern Turkey, Smyrna and cities like that were dominated by Greek entrepreneurs and the Greek middle class. So it didn't have political power as it did under the Roman Empire, but it had cultural and economic power.
We heard from our guests in the previous sessions that the revolution started from the diaspora. Is that true?
The diaspora were the great forces that pushed for the revolution. And I have a very mixed view and a quite controversial view on...
Which is why I'm asking you.
Thank you. In the sense that many people tell the story that the diaspora was the source and the origin and the inspiration of the revolution. And that is true. But also, that's the story of the winners, because they were the intellectuals, so they could write the story. They were the people who had access to power, they could talk to politicians, therefore they got the audience, the ear of people of power. So those two factors often meant that the diaspora, whether they were in London, Stockholm, or in Odessa, or in Moscow, these prominent Greeks who were educated and were embodiments of the European Enlightenment vision, which put greater emphasis on individual character, but was also a kind of resurrection of ancient Greek philosophical ideas as well. So this strong combination of philosophy, political, economic access meant that these people were very prominent. They were prominent in promoting an ideology, prominent in enabling certain resources and funds. They even smuggled guns into Greece, some of them, you know, and they found ways to support local insurrections. They themselves were hopeless militarily. They were terrible fighters.
Isn't the pen mightier than the sword?
Well, the mouth is certainly, and the checkbook maybe. Not that there was checks in those days, but they were terrible on the battlefront. But they were very good at harnessing international importance, because remember, this was the first revolution in Europe. This was the first insurrection in Europe for a nation state to become out of a tyranny of empires. Everywhere you went, there were people subjugated by an empire, whether it was the Western European empires or the Eastern empires. This was the first nation to want to prove itself. Now, for that to happen, I think something else must have been necessary. And that element is impossible to prove. All I can prove is a gut feeling. Because in my view, you can have all the influence of the diaspora, but if you don't have the people inside the nation believing in that idea and already upholding that idea, not importing it, but believing that it's theirs, it's never going to take root. You cannot impose the idea of a revolution as if it was a product purely of European enlightenment. When I listened to my father and his generation, they were peasants, right? They had never been to university or education. They've never read Plato or Aristotle. But something of the ancient ideals of Greek philosophy, Greek politics, Greek democracy never got extinguished in their bodies and minds and souls. Those values were still core in their identity and culture. And you hear this in little ways in which they talk about ordinary things, about the way in which they organise life and care for each other in the community and responsibility they have for others, and the value that they put upon education. These peasants believed in these values, and they did not need to be told that this is important. They already had that as central to their importance. And so, in my opinion, the Greek Revolution started in the heart and soul of the peasantry, because they're the ones who did the fighting. They're the ones who actually succeeded in overturning tyranny and fighting to create something. Did they become successful at creating a perfect nation state? Well, you'd have to be very tolerant to say yes to that. But that's a little bit of a story about its origins for me.
Viv, before we invited you to this conversation, what came to your mind when you heard of the Greek Revolution? Did you hear the narrative of Greeks against Turks, or did you think of what Nikos said?
Well, I can resonate with a couple of points that Nikos said, but when I think about the Greek Revolution and so on, I think about social harmony. I want the Greeks and the Turks to live well here in Victoria. That's what I think about. From the historical context that can be put in perspective here so that we can all live harmoniously together, because we are a very diverse state here in Victoria and a diverse country. But I do share your view about the intellectuals and the peasants and the fight and the wars and so on and so forth, because for me, the same with the history of Vietnam as well. As a country, we've been dominated by the Chinese for 1,000 years, and the French and the Japanese. You can have all of the intellects that come in from overseas that are Vietnamese, but you need the people on the ground and their values, their belief in their sovereignty and their country. That's what I think got the Chinese out after 1,000 years. And that's what I think got some other people out after a few hundred years.
So there's a lot more in common between the Greeks and the Vietnamese than we ever thought.
Well, there are a lot. We just haven't talked about it. We just haven't had a chance to talk about it. And that's one of the things I so value in this role, because you get to learn a little bit about the history of each country, each cultural background, each community, and then you try to work out how everyone can live together. And we do have our challenges, but that's what we need to do in this place.
The notion of cultural identity and the first nation state in the Greek nation state in the Balkan area, do you think that we carry that with us? We still, as Greeks abroad, do we still want to create nations everywhere we go? Are we ghettos, or do we blend in beautifully in a colourful mosaic like here in Victoria?
Very, very good question. Even the Greek Revolution itself represents some of the contradictions that this question and that we've already identified. After the success, let's call it, of the Greek Revolution, one of the biggest questions that the Greeks who had power was, who is a Greek? Are the diasporas members? Will they have rights to be a member of the parliament? Will they be allowed to be judges? Will they have official roles in the new bureaucracy? Or do you have to be born in Greece in order to have power in Greece? So the diaspora was never received with complete equivalence and open arms. There was a power struggle, and there were people who said, I fought for this bit of land, I want to control it now. Because you gave us some money, doesn't mean, or you had the idea, doesn't mean that you're going to have influence here. So there was this long story of conflict as to whether you had to be from Greece or of Greek heritage in order to be. And this is still relevant today. I can have a Greek passport. I cannot vote in Greece. I can only vote in Greece if with my Greek passport, I go back and live in Greece. So this diaspora relationship and this contradiction and this tension about you're a little bit Greek or you're completely Greek or you're not Greek at all is something that we still feel today in the Greek cultural identity. And I think one of the great opportunities we have in Australia is to rethink our relationship to identity. Do we think of ourselves as an identity that is something that's natural to us because my grandmother and grandfather and father and mother were born in Greece. Well, on my mother's side they weren't, they were born in Turkey, Pontian Turks, Greeks I mean. But the point is do we see that as a sort of natural boundary that contains and confines us? Or do we start to think about this as a more flexible, fluid, dynamic thing that is constantly changing in terms of my relationships, in terms of my experiences and influences, and then I become more porous and more hybrid. And so as a consequence, you and I have just discovered that our cultures share something in common. This country enabled that. The perspective that I have on the Greek Revolution, very, very, very few Greeks in Greece share. I would be the 1% if I was in a conference now amongst people. They are quite proud of this Enlightenment vision, this diaspora as the intellectuals, as the leadership role. They disregard completely the role of the peasant and the ordinary person. In fact, most intellectuals in Greece are upper middle class for many generations, and look at contempt at their own rural and peasant countryside, and are indifferent to the diaspora completely, despite all their promises and proposals. And so there is this profound conflicts and tensions for class reasons, for historical reasons, for insecurity reasons in Greece. And so the kind of dynamic understanding that we have about culture and identity is a product of countries like this. And we should cherish this thing and learn to realize that what we do now, very ordinarily, live in harmony, as you say, Greeks, Turks, and everybody else, is something that our grandparents' generation and great-grandparents' generation also achieved. It's not unique to us. There was, in that Ottoman period, there was great harmony. Even in Cyprus, before the division of Cyprus, I had a student who was Turkish Cypriot. He laments and mourns the loss of his Greek neighbours and Greek friends and Greek food and Greek customs that he had when he lived side by side with other Greeks in Nicosia. He feels like an exile when he was pushed out of that, and he regrets, and I would go so far as to say he hates the invasion that was led by his own country against people. So we have this history and this capacity for coexistence and harmony, understanding. It's a question of how we cultivate it.
Yeah.
Viv, is that challenging as the chair of the commission?
I mean, from my perspective, identity comes from many different aspects. I look at one aspect of it, and that's culture and religion. That forms part of the term identity. So that's why we call it cultural diversity. But the identity of a person doesn't just come from his or her or their cultural background. There's that, and there's his or her or their age cohort, their profession, their career, their friends, the activities that they belong to. All of these aspects forms, in my opinion, a person's identity. We look at it from a cultural perspective, and that is important because we are such a young country, and many of us have rarely kind of been here in this country. You know, you've been here, for a couple of generations. I have two. Many other African communities might have just been here for one generation. So they more strongly align to their identity as their culture. So their culture is a dominant part of their identity. But over time, it might not be. What we try to promote is whatever it is that you consider as your identity, you do want to have something that you feel and you believe in that is important. You do want something that you can feel belong. You have a purpose. And so that, to me, from a Victorian Multicultural Commission's perspective, is important. Because we need a number of aspects to come together for us to be who we are as an individual, as how we describe. I describe to my children as a mum. I describe myself to someone else as something else, and these things changes. And Mike, I remember way back when I was a young bub, Mike said to me that, you know, this cultural identity isn't something that is set in concrete, and I share that view. I feel sometimes more Vietnamese, sometimes I feel more of a female, sometimes I feel more of an Australian, depending on the context and the setting that I am in. But to be able to have that skill and that ability to kind of, you know, expand, contract, take the shape and so on and so forth, that is a skill that the person needs to have, it needs to acquire, and that can come from education, experience, interactions, engagements. And that's what we do. We try to create many different environments for people to try, test, experiment, and so on and so forth, and form a view for themselves about who they are.
What were your first memories of the Greek Revolution?
For me, I think it came mostly through symbols. I remember vividly at Greek school looking at all of these posters of heroes who I didn't quite understand, or I didn't actually, you know, have the full complete story of. But I remember them sort of vividly, and I could sort of keep seeing flashbacks of them and them in new places. I see them in cafes. Sometimes I see them popping up online, and I think often we have quite a simplistic understanding of who they were and what they sort of did. And I think you only discover later the sort of light and the dark sides of the story. And I discovered quite a lot on Monday in our last sort of session that I sat in, that it's very difficult to convey a complex story like that to younger people. So I think it's often caricatured, but I guess I'm pretty happy that I understand a bit more of the complexity sort of behind it. But the symbols for me are things that I think will stick for a long time, but I guess I reworked them a bit. I'm sort of remixing them in my mind.
I went to Greek school, so I learned all of my Greek history and part of our everyday class that we had. And one of my first memories is, Dad, I need to draw a picture for the Dimitria, and we need to draw someone from the Greek Revolution. So my dad and I sat there and scribbled a little picture of Kolokotroni, and that's how we learned about the Greek Revolution and how we were first exposed to it. Back then, 20 odd years ago, it was all, who are these heroes, who are these heroes of the revolution, and what did they do for us, and why are we so lucky to have the life that we have now in Greece and abroad, and how do we celebrate this liberation and freedom, but also, you know, recognise the struggles and the difficulties of the times. But as we got older, as what you mentioned earlier, you know, we learn things as adults, and obviously there was a dark side to that. So I guess for me now, I've got nieces and nephews who are going through primary school and Greek school and all that kind of stuff, and it's about trying to teach them both sides and put that in a kid-friendly way to say, hey, it's not just bells and whistles, there's some other things that we need to consider, so just keep that in the back of your mind as you go through life.
Esther, I didn't ask you yesterday, what was your first, the first images, since you're an artist, of the Greek Revolution in your head?
It's good you pose it in artistic terms, because it's similar to you two. And it was Papu endlessly drawing Kolokotroni, you know, with being somewhere in the mountains with his animals, with the, you know, the birds in the sky. His very elaborate, you know, torva and what might have been on it or drawn on it. And Papu was just constantly, just kind of drawing, but also then telling us stories about these heroes. But of course, Kolokotroni was from somewhere not very far from where Papu spent his life, and then the revolution began where my parents now live, and so it was part of that kind of lore, I guess, that just becomes part of the myths and stories that are told. And like Nikos was saying, it's sort of this those values that just kind of get passed on and then get drawn upon at different times when a different story or myth wants to be told. And then in a previous episode, we talked about that kind of, you know, yes, the role of the diaspora or the role of people in cities, particularly people in rural places, but also the role of the well-meaning Europeans, the Philhellenes, who thought it would be a really great idea to, you know, juggle their pen/sword skills and come along, like, you know, the infamous story of Lord Byron. But the way that then instituted this real cultural schism in Greece of, okay, now we're kind of framing this foundational revolutionary moment in this vision that a lot of outsiders have of this glorified period of the Greece of the past. And the way that that's also stayed in the sort of imaginings of, okay, well, which are we restoring some kind of classical past Greece, or are we building something new that's contemporary?
I think, like most of history that I learnt at that age, I didn't care about it, and I wasn't really interested in it, to be honest. And that's partly because only later in life did history have the empathy that you need to really engage with the stories of the time. So, yes, for me, my first experience and understanding of the Greek Revolution was very caricature and very like just trying to tell the story of Greek versus Turkey. And for me, that story was actually more directly conveyed to me through my yaya, who was part of the Smyrna swap. So, you know, in terms of that relationship, that ongoing history between Turkey and Greece, it sort of had much more life and relevance that in a way overshadowed and made the revolution just much more further away and not so connected to today.
So I learned, because I come from Kyprios, my recollection is about the Sugiotises and all the women portrayed in the folk songs, like "I Δέσπο κάνει πόλεμο." I still remember some of those folk songs. So it's very interesting. It wasn't an in-depth understanding of what had happened. For us kids was like, yeah, another day, no school, going to the Parelasi and having a good time. When I came to Australia and I was a teacher, right, and teaching little kids about it, there wasn't a lot there that I could rely on. It was all the images of all the Kolokotroni, Karaiskaki, and those images. Not a lot of women. Still, the textbooks don't give you much. And I'm not sure that many of us know really the real story. I think it's this year, 200 years, that a lot of the history is sort of rewritten, and you get different views like Nikos. What came to my mind as you were talking, Nikos, was why is this? Is it because Greeks are elitist? Is it because they value education? What is it? Why is this ideology, was then and now? And it's here too. I'm just thinking that that exists in other cultures as well. It's not just a Greek thing, is it?
No. The legacy sometimes distorts our perception of the origin. And let me make a silly little anecdote, because we're all talking about visual memories. Lord Byron, of course, was the very famous example of the Philhellene. And he was passionate about helping to liberate Greece. But he was also a graffiti artist. Did you know that?
No, I have no idea.
If you go to the famous temple of Poseidon in Sunio, just outside of Athens, on the base of the temple, there's this big B-Y-R-O-N. I used to do it on my desk with a little compass, right? But Byron did it on the temple. He carved his name on the temple. So the great poet was also a graffiti artist. But going back to the more serious point.
He wanted his name there.
He wanted to leave his legacy as well.
That's right.
That's
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I did it on a desk, he did it on a temple.
It's better, he did it better than you.
Yeah, his is forever. His is forever. He did it on marble. But my point in all this is that the history books that we're all victims of, the history books tell the story from there to here, from the perspective of those who could tell a story and had the power to write a story. History is told by the winners.
Yes, that is true. I agree.
Even if it's the Greek winners, they didn't tell the full Greek story. And now, like VARVARA, we take pride in the fact that Greeks achieved a national identity, a revolution. They overthrew a tyranny. They achieved greater independence. And so we think about it in terms of, but my papu was from the village where this started. My yaya is from this part of Greece where the women had a very prominent role. My grandparents were from Smyrna where the entrepreneurs were very active in supporting the navy. So we all find a point that elevates and recognizes the stream that contribute to this big eruption. But that's looking for the thing that brings it to the present, and so we celebrate that point. But what we don't see when we celebrate that point is all the things underneath it. What is it that made those women think that they were equal, or that they had a capacity to fight? What is it that made her great-grandfather's friends think that, yes, when Kolokotroni goes, I will lead, they will follow, or that he was being pushed by them into this position? So we have to think to ourselves, not that Greece was this first country in Europe to achieve independence. We have to think that at some point someone said, you should be free. And people said yes. Everywhere else in Europe at that point of time, if someone said, you should be free, they said, are you joking? Are you real? Look at the feudal landlords. Look at the dukes that are in power. We can never throw them off our back. No one said, no, I want to be free. But those ordinary people said, yes, I can be free. And when you read the ancient Greek plays, the role of the women, it's exactly the same person as you see in those folkloric dances. When you see these entrepreneurs from Smyrna or these proud men from Messaloniki, it's the same person that exists in this ancient world. Somehow or another, that value survived and got into the fibre of people's minds and lives. And we've lost sight of that underbelly, that undercurrent. And I regret that even today, when the most interesting Marxist Greek historians write the story of the Greek Revolution, they are still fixated on the archives. What's in the archives?
What was written before?
Exactly. Who was writing that?
The elites. the men.
The men and the elites. And the other ordinary stories are still invisible to this day. Find me an anthology on the Greek Revolution that speaks to this phenomenon that these three people already identified through their family histories.
That dichotomy between the privileged and the oppressed, do you see that in other cultures as well? And does education play a big role in, for example, the Vietnamese community?
It exists everywhere. In other cultures that I see through my role, we see elders, we see tribal leaders from their countries of origin playing out their role here. They see them having influence. They see, I see women men from, say, my own community who had an overseas education and they came to Australia before the mass, the peasants equivalent, got on their boats and came to Australia. That mindset exists. I've been here before, I had an overseas education, I am a better Vietnamese than you are here in Australia. That exists in just about every other community that I've seen in the current role and in my own as well.
What does the Commission do to take away that shame?
For me, it comes down to the ability and the willingness of different cultures and different communities and leaders, for that matter, to be able to live harmoniously here in Victoria. And that comes down to some of the common goals that we need to achieve. For example, we need to achieve greater employment for young people. We need to achieve greater representation for women from different cultural backgrounds. So it doesn't matter whether I feel more elitist about my Vietnamese heritage compared to another Vietnamese person. We are not talking about that here. We're talking about, do we collectively have greater representation by women from different cultural backgrounds, different religious settings here in Victoria? And if the answer is no, let's come together and let's work on that. Let's not worry about whether I think highly of the other Vietnamese person or the other way around. To me, that is the focus. Because if we take into account the historical settings, I'll never win, I'll never get anywhere.
No. Are women the key in changing multicultural communities? Traditionally, we have men that were the village leader, and now they're the community leader here. And we see a little wave. I don't think it's a tsunami yet with women in leadership in community structures. Are they the key in that
Women
change?
is indeed a core focus of the VMC as well as other legislative settings. And it's because here in this country, we set certain standards, we set certain values, we set certain bars. And for that to happen, things need to occur in our community, in our society, and we need to push for that. I don't think we've made significant progress over the last 5-10 years in terms of women in leadership and representation of women from different cultural communities. Every time you make 2 steps forward, there's another step back. And that's happening across this country. I think we need a lot more of that effort to be undertaken. And it can't just be done by women. It's got to be done by everybody, men included. And there are many male champions as there are female champions. But that does need to be focused on a lot more. And I also think it's not a zero-sum game. I think for some men, they see that as well. There are these positions, if I let a woman acquire it, then that means I don't have a position. I don't see why a bloke should see himself letting go of that role. It's equal. It's equal footing here. If that role could be achieved by a woman holding it or a bloke holding it, then let's just put it out there. If there are barriers for women to be able to compete for that, let's look at those barriers and let's look at bringing them down, look at breaking them, and let's look at level playing field, which is what we are trying to do, to create level playing field and to tell the government they're the ones that set the rules, they're the ones that direct the resources to say, well, there are a lot of barriers over here and over there, and these are what we, the VMC, think you ought to be thinking about and looking at doing.
Vivian's talking about opportunity. Was that also the case about the peasants back in 1821? Were people poor? Did they not have opportunity? Is that why they revolted?
It's hard to know because we don't have any evidence, do we?
What does your gut say?
That's a very good point. My gut says that they revolted not just out of fear of starvation, but out of aspiration. And I believe that aspiration is very deep in the Greek psyche. And that's something that that's what I'm wanting to celebrate in this moment. It's that deeper aspiration that exists. And what I want to, the barrier that I want to break down is this one about snobbery. Because basically this elitism that we're talking about is a form of snobbery. And where does snobbery come from? A deeper insecurity. The really wise person does not treat an uneducated person as inferior. A really wise person goes to the poor person, thinks, I can learn from this person because everyone has a human intelligence.
We talk about perceptions and history, despite the fact that by nature it's meant to be giving us facts. We all know that there are other factors that influence the way it is taught and the way it is understood by people. I did my primary and secondary education in Greece, and obviously the way I was taught about the revolution had elements of ethnocentricity, nationalism, pride of our heritage. Greece needed that. As a small nation, we needed to hang on to our past, the glorious past. And I think that helped us a bit too. The perception of the diaspora, but also all the other nations, that Greece has contributed to civilization, to democracy, to freedom, contributed, in my view, in some regards, making the revolution more attractive to non-Greeks coming into it. The other important point that we need to make as part of this series of discussions is, it comes from what Vivian talked about, harmony. That word harmony, which is also a Greek word. If you really examine the grassroots of both communities, Turkish and Greeks, that perceived hatred that the politicians are inculcating and imposing upon the two societies is not there.
Before the Turkish occupation, Cyprus was a country where harmony existed throughout the country. There was no conflict between the communities there, nothing at all. To the contrary, there was a lot of cooperation in all the fields. It was only when foreign forces like Turkey, for example, started looking at Cyprus as the unsinkable carrier, as Kissinger described it. What existed before the Turkish invasion, I would say it was an ideal situation for communities living together with no problems at all. But even now, nearly 50 years after the Turkish invasion, the two communities there, if they are left alone, they will find a solution within 24 hours. There is no doubt about that.
We're not historians here, we just want each other's lived experience and truth. If we were going to look at this adaptively, what Kypros said about Cyprus, that trauma that new Australians carry with them from a conflict zone or from a political disruption, how do we deal with it in Australia? What is that we do well?
The fact that we have, like Mike has said, an institution that supports cultural diversity, that supports people's experiencing barriers to a whole range of services and rights and responsibility is a good thing. But the fact that we put a timeline on what is a refugee and how long he or she or they require to settle in a country, that to me is an arbitrary number. So a person coming out of Kabul, there is a definition that within 5 years there are settlement support services. But what happens if that person only needs 2, but another person needs 10? And then there's every variation between. The system doesn't allow for that flexibility. We make a blanket rule about 5 years is a good number or 10 years is a good number. That is an area I certainly think we can do a lot more on. The trauma and the lived experiences that people have with them when they come to Australia, particularly when I look at the humanitarian intake, I think we could do a lot more on that. We don't look at it as a systemic sort of approach. If I speak from my own experience, when my parents first came, they just focused on getting settled. They would pack all of the stuff that they had from the war and the time Dad spent in prison somewhere at the back of their minds, because there was an immediate need that had to be attended to here. But that comes back, and I think, and that might explain why Victoria has a commission report into mental health and well-being. Right? They now have a new well-being act. Things like that there is greater recognition. But I think we could do a lot better on that trauma that people have with them, that lived experience. And we could do a lot better on turning that experience into something more positive. And I think that's certainly an area we advocate for. I mean, I'm advocating right now for a direct funding package to multicultural, multi-faith communities on mental health and well-being, because we haven't got that at the moment throughout the 2 years of the pandemic, or almost. And the multicultural communities have been so hard hit by this pandemic because of our family. We don't think family as a family of 4 or as immediate, we think extended. Because of the way we celebrate, we have so much to celebrate. You know, there's so much in the Greek culture that I don't know and I want to know more of. And because of where we work in hospitality, in retail, in distribution, and that's impacted us so much in terms of mental health and well-being, and we haven't got a direct funding package. There it is. I'm advocating for one.
When the Greek state was being built, foreign systems were imposed.
That's right.
Was that a solution that helped the Greeks unite under a foreign system because everybody had different ideas, or was it the wrong thing to do?
It was what was available. And it also showed a deep sense of insecurity amongst that leadership group. And this goes back to the point I was making about elites and their refusal to learn from their own history sometimes. Their refusal to engage with their own natural intelligence, to cultivate their own history. So they were so desperate to look like the enlightened Europeans that one of the things they did, of course, was to clean up the language, to eliminate any kind of hybrid element in the language. So they imposed a completely artificial language, which was there to cleanse, katharevosa, to cleanse the language of any kind of foreign influence. But they were frozen and completely rigid and insecure in my mind in terms of how they imposed standards and values and brought in a king from Bavaria. Don't tell anyone. Our Greek flag is the Bavarian flag. You know the BMW, the sign on the bike? It's a Bavarian Motorworks, right? It's a
So what you're
white
saying
flag
is that BMW is Greek?
King Otto was Greek, yeah, sure.
Now I can see why you're one part of the 1%.
They hate me, huh?
Yes, I can see why.
So if we were to draw a lesson, it would probably what not to do in building a multicultural system?
No, that's not what I'm saying. But to learn, to connect. Of course, learn the best that Europe has to offer. Why would you ignore the Enlightenment? That would be stupid. That would be suicide. But at the same time, why also treat your own culture with contempt? Why be embarrassed about your own folkloric history? It took to the 1950s and 1940s for the generation of poets, Seferis, Eiletis, and the musicians like Mikis Theodorakis and Manos Chatzidakis to synthesize for the first time the complex rhythms and sounds and histories of our Romiosini, our Romanness. You know, Greekness was called Romanness. And to combine both ecclesiastical music, folkloric music, rebetika music, high Western European avant-garde music, that was a fusion. It wasn't a rejection, and it wasn't certainly a hierarchy. It was a flat incorporation, and that showed incredible creativity and intelligence. That's the kind of mentality that we need to foster. Not the one that says, oh, everything that we did was wrong and stupid, and let's just follow the Germans. Sometimes we need to follow the Germans, it's true.
On economic policy, perhaps?
No, the BMW motorbike.
So, Nico, did you have a comment?
That's a good point, and that's what I think is good about multicultural Victoria and Australia. We don't have, the culture and the values can be shaped, and that's shaped by the people, and everybody gets a chance to take part in the shaping of our culture and values here in Australia, rather than making everybody be like whatever it is that somebody thinks that we should be.
Exactly.
And that is why I think the role of the VMC or institutions like that is really, really important in making sure that everybody gets a chance to participate.
You're probably going to say I'm a global citizen, but my question is, are you Australian Greek, Greek Australian, or Australian Greek?
I'm from St Kilda.
I feel like it comes from a very personal set of experiences. So what you've grown up with, a sort of connection to place in a way, if you have grown up with a connection to place that happens to be overseas, you do have those set of experiences that you carry with you for the rest of your life. But then it depends on how you interpret place as well. There's so much more to look at than just beyond our physical sort of surrounds. So social infrastructures which really shape our experiences, our cultural connections.
I'll respond to your question with a mathematical paradox. Right? They're both Greek words, by the way. I feel 100% Australian and 100% Greek.
I'm a Rotarian, and in 2017 I told my Rotarian members that I'm going back to my homeland, and they took a little bit offence that I said I'm going to my homeland. And they said, you're going back to your birthplace. This is your homeland. And I thought about it, and maybe I don't have the right term, but like you, I believe I'm 100% Greek, and I was born in Greece, and I believe I'm 100% Australian.
I struggle with the notion that our fellow Australian would tell me what words to use.
Yeah,
I really struggle with that. I
Yeah.
wonder how you handled that.
I said I have to think about it. I really, and it was something that that created some further thought. But I do believe that it is the birthplace, that is my birthplace, and that I was brought up here, so I have two homelands.
Defining yourself as Greek sometimes is an administrative terminology. In other words, you need to say that I am Greek when you're doing something that you have to show your nationality, etc. But whether you're feeling as Greek or not, it has nothing to do with your ID, your passport, etc. Okay, it's a personal choice. It's a personal, more or less, thing. Okay, and we have so many different nationalities here. Obviously, those nationalities think differently when they identify with their country of origin, but at the same time, they are sharing common values of this country as well here. Now, whether this is a multicultural society or not, to be honest, I have my doubts. Because the idea of multiculturalism started, as Mr. ZAFIROPOULOS would know, around 76, 80. Okay, and since then we spent billions of dollars. It's nearly 20, 40 years since the seeds of multiculturalism, or people started talking about multiculturalism, and we are still talking about that thing, okay? And we can't say that we are a multicultural society, because for me, a multicultural society is when I go outside, for example, or when you turn on the ABC, it's not always everything in English. Why do we need a special broadcasting service to broadcast programs in other languages or about other languages? Why doesn't the ABC does that, for example? Why? And the need for SBS, for example, arose as part of the failure of the mainstream media to show something about the non-Anglo-Saxon communities here.
You know, as someone who lived in those two worlds quite comfortably for most of my life and understood to succeed you actually need to minimize your ethnicity, as someone who's really started to only recently grab hold of that and realize you've got to be proud, as you say, and you've got to be loud about it. But this conversation about the Greek Revolution and Hellenism as it existed before the politics and Greekness did, it immediately made me think about, I suppose, the insights we have when you have a different culture and what it means to keep that identity underneath, and what actually you've got to contribute to the discussion today about the place of first Australians and what it means to continue culture in an oppressed environment. And actually, we've got an opportunity to be in solidarity with First Peoples to advocate for a different relationship with them and to really help this country mature in its own identity of who it is and how complex it is and messy it is, and our position with First Peoples too.
Do you think there's an element of safety when we use words that others understand, even if we don't identify with them?
You just reminded me of, I did an interview a long time ago with a well-known Anglo-Australian broadcaster who asked a similar question, but in a completely racist way, which was...
I'm hoping mine was
no,
racist.
that was spot on, but his was kind of, so why is it that Greeks and others come and they all stick with their little groups and, use that similar language? And I said to him, if you... Let's say you've just come here for the first time, all these people, say it's a party. Isn't the first thing that you're going to do to look around and see who you know, go and say hello to them, and maybe you'll tell some of your stories and you'll have a nice time, they might introduce you to someone else. Identity and culture starts with the familiar, and then it finds ways to articulate what's important to us to other people. Art and culture, of course, and particularly, artistic experiences try to surprise and astound us, in different ways, but they also touch on and challenge aspects of identity. And so that also just brings to mind a question you asked earlier about when someone says to you, as they did to you, oh, no, what you mean is this. Anytime someone, dares to tell you what your identity is, that's oppression. Whether it's meant in a, harsh, politically oppressive way or a, bland, rhetorical kind of way, it's still oppressive, which goes to the great point that you made. Do we have multiculturalism here? And we said in a previous episode that multiculturalism is in fact always the underlying. It's a political structure that tries to impose something that is monocultural. But we had this moment in Australia in the 80s where, there was a focus, there was policy, there was funding. But I remember, on Channel 10 on Sunday mornings, remember, there was Let's Go Greek Edaxi, there was the Italian Variety Hour, there was programming that was presented in Greek and in Italian. As soon as SBS appeared, we don't have to do that anymore, because we have the special broadcasting service, and so we ghettoise Australian multiculturalism as though it's this optional parallel universe. Yeah, we can't have this sort of optional approach to supporting people, exactly as you've been saying, to have that strength and that harmony. It's not optional, it's the basis of society.
And that's a difficult thing, isn't it? Because if you don't have a focus, if you don't have a priority for it, who is going to take care of it, right? So if the VMC, in my opinion, we would have a totally diverse, inclusive, harmonious society where the VMC ceases to exist, right? If we didn't have it, that would be the ideal scenario, but we know it doesn't. So somebody needs to give this thing called multiculturalism, stewardship, but also focus and priority, and be like an absolute dog, like with a bone. Like, hey, what about this? What about that? Somebody has to remind the system, because the system as it stands right now doesn't support that. It doesn't even support women of any colour, white included, let alone people of colour. So somebody needs to focus, and I wish I had more authority, but that I think is the thing. Then we can change the system. This is where I support your point about the peasants, right? You can have a bunch of elites over here, but it's the people that will drive the change. And we need the will of the people. The people elect the representatives, and we can do a better job at electing the people into the structure, so they then can change the structure. We don't have that. I don't think the democracy in Australia is really good, but we could do a lot more, because the people who are in Parliament are a reflection of our votes.
In trying to distill a couple of lessons, maybe what to do or what not to do from the Greek Revolution, is there anything relevant to us today?
I think we've said a lot of things that are still relevant. One of the things is where does the will to change come from? Where does the idea that this is not good enough come from? Where does the drive that says this is not legitimate? We've had all these examples about how trust can be broken, how people can express creativity, can yearn for some better life, or find ways to mingle and mix things together, overcome barriers, snobberies, hierarchies. All these things, we have to question these things that we think are normal. Why should it be normal that my head of school, my dean, my provost, my vice-chancellor from my university, they're all English? And we don't think that's a problem. They're all born, educated, and products of the English education system. If they were all Italians, we'd think we're crazy.
Has anything changed in your mind about Greek Australians during this conversation? Or like there's all this knowledge from the Greek Revolution that has come through. Has anything shifted or?
Well, I've always thought of the Greeks as being so successfully integrated into the broader community. What I've learned today is that there are different perspectives within the broader Greek community itself. And I certainly learned a lot and I will try and find some more if there are any textbooks or anything, Nikos, about the peasants and the stuff that the 1%. I'd like to know a bit more about this 1% business.
Yeah.
Thank you both for coming today, and thank you to our audience. This was Think Greek. Καλή νύχτα σας.